What is going on, you guys? Happy New Year's. Happy New Year's. I'm glad to be back. It's been a little while. I was spending some time with family, but we're back with another DIY series video. This time we're working on a chevron pattern fireplace with the mantle build out. You'll see here in the video the whole process, how we got it done. So let's get straight into it. By the way, like usual, all the products you see that I'm using in this video will be linked down below. You know, it does help the channel. So if you see anything that you like or you don't have that you may want, go ahead and go down into the description and you'll find those products down there. So first thing we did is we actually added some studs to the wall to bring out the wall just ever so slightly, added some depth. You see me doing the anneal test to make sure everything is secured to the wall. But once we framed it out, that's when we started to build out the design. And here I'm ripping a sheet of plywood. You don't have to use anything fancy, none of that sanded birch stuff. This is never gonna be seen. This is just to create a platform for the chevron pattern to sit on. So you can see me, I'm just cutting it. I do have a longer track for my tracks also. Don't give it to me, please. And then all we're doing here is just mapping out where certain things are located, such as the TV mount, the fireplace. Sam is just kind of getting that leveled line so I can take it back outside and cut it down. Here, I'm just finding the midpoint so I can start the chevron pattern, and I'm starting it right at that edge where you see me. It just worked best when I started it there. If I were to do it again, I'd probably start at the bottom. That way there's no issues or discrepancies. Okay, so now for the fun part. 45 degrees with a 45-degree angle is what you're gonna use. So with your miters, you're gonna wanna have a 45-degree angle plus a bevel of 45 degrees for those outside edges, and you'll see why later on. But the midpoints are all 45 degrees. That way you have that nice 45-degree angle for each piece, and it gives that cool chevron pattern look. What we do is we glue the seam down the center. That way it'll eliminate splitting as much as possible. We are using MDF, so you know there is some expansion and contraction, but the glue helps keep everything nice and tight. So you glue it, wipe it down, put some brad nails in place. We used a lightweight spackle for this application here. It was just easy to sand down and didn't really do too much damage to the actual chevron pattern itself. And then we put in a top coat over top of that. So we're just working our way up, you know, wiping down the glue, because the glue does get heavy and built up. So make sure you wipe it down. That way it doesn't build up and you're having to deal with sanding it tremendously. In that middle seam, we did add heavier spackle. That way it filled that seam nicely. After that dried, we sanded it and then added lightweight over top of it. And just created some holes with the Forstner bit to feed the cables through. Okay, so this is an important step, but also a dangerous step. The reason why is because your hands are so close to the blade with these pieces, but basically these are the edges. So when the chevron meets the corners of the wall, it returns and creates this cool 3D effect. And all I'm doing here is just cutting the pieces at that 45-degree angle with that 45-degree bevel, right? So that it meets at that seam. And you can see Sam here, she's using CA glue with a little bit of normal glue and just pressing those in place. And here's the CA glue we're using. I don't use this CA glue anymore. I don't like the way it sets. We use a new glue. You'll find it down below. It's phenomenal. We haven't had any issues with it. And then once the CA glue dries, you give it a sand and you put it in place. And right here, we're just framing out where the TV mount goes. That way there's no exposed studs or no rough edges. So once the chevron pattern was up, we started working on the mount. for the mantle. All right, and all we're using is 2x6s. We glue it together, we pop a few brad nails so it sits in place, and then I screw it from underneath. This method just works well with keeping everything straight in a line the way that it needs to be. It might be a little overkill, but I'd rather, you know, have a little overkill than, you know, you try to screw something into place and it keeps shifting around on you. So we're just using some Tight Bond 2, brad nailing it in place, and then we're screwing it from underneath. It's not completely necessary to use both 16 gauge and 18 gauge. If you have an 18 gauge nailer, you can get away with just that. But because I had the 16 gauge on hand with 2.5-inch nails, I went ahead and used that just to secure things in place. And I'm using 3.5-inch SPAC screws. I love these screws. They have the T20 tips that don't slip away from your bits. I highly recommend using T-star bits instead of your normal Phillip heads or flathead screws. They are horrible. So now I'm just marking the center point of the mount itself. That way I can drill the holes for the lag bolts that are gonna go into the studs in the wall. So I'm just squaring them out, figuring out where those holes need to be. And then I'm just using I believe it's a 1/4-inch bit to drill the pilot holes for the lag bolts. And the lag bolts, they're 5 inches with a washer, a 1-inch washer over top of that. Works well. If you have an impact driver, definitely use an impact driver for this application. I found that my standard drill kind of bogged down on me a little bit, but the impact will drive it all the way in. Okay, so once we had the TV mount up in place, Sam was working on painting the wall and I was working on a crown molding return. So instead of placing crown molding over top of this, look at my facial expression. Instead of placing the crown molding over top of the design, we stopped it on either ends with a return just so it looked clean. And I'm just using the CA glue to bond these two pieces together. I pop a small brad nail in place and then I fill the seam with a little bit of spackle, as well as sanded it down. That way it looked clean. But this process works well. Once you apply the CA glue, it typically is like locked in place and it won't come apart unless you're like forcefully trying to pull it apart. But it gives it a clean look, clean aesthetic, and you'll see what it looks like on the wall here shortly. Now, I'm sure there's a way to do this with one person, but since it is a long stretch, Sam just helped me with this process. One thing I will recommend is brad nail right next to your design. That way you can get the placement correct. Sam will hold it up on the other end, but you could just check it to make sure that it is exactly where you want it to be and then start brad nailing it. And then that's what the crown molding return looks like when it's all said and done. That's on both sides. It's a clean look. And then we just began putting everything back in place. As you can see, everything is painted. And if you look at that edge of the chevron pattern, you see how it goes up and then returns and comes back down. That's where that 45-degree miter works its magic, as well as that 45-degree cut right around that corner. So we just checked everything, make sure it was level, mounted everything back in place, put the sound bar back up. The client didn't want the sound bar on the mantle because they wanted to put stuff on the mantle. And then the best part, sliding it in just like a glove with love. Here's a little secret sauce for you. We actually brad nailed underneath the mantle to keep it in place. We just popped a few brad nails and then used a little bit of walnut wood filler to clean it up. And here's the grand reveal. Wow. Came out nice. What you guys think? You can see those mitered corners, super tight. The chevron pattern was pretty dope. I like the idea. The color is Arctic Seal, for those that want to know. Look at that mantle. We made it out of maple, soft maple, with a dark walnut stain. We put about 2 coats and then we put a polyurethane over top of it.